My name is Sergio Gonzalez. I'm Assistant Professor of Latinx Studies here at Marquette.
Thank you. And how did you first become interested in the discipline of history?
That goes back to when I was a kid, I think. When I was a child, my first aspiration was to be a K-12 teacher. And so actually my first career was as a secondary education teacher in Madison. I went to undergraduate and I majored in secondary education, Spanish and history. And I had a chance to teach social studies in Spanish and English in Madison for a few years before making the decision to go back to graduate school. And I made the decision, there's only one chance really that I wanted to do, which was to study history. I am the university's first hire in Latinx studies. We have had at the university for a few years efforts to build a Latinx studies program, and faculty across different disciplines have been doing their best to build the program. I was brought in specifically to teach classes in Latinx studies and to help build the program as well over the next few years.
Thank you. And what sort of projects are you currently working on?
Yeah, so I am trained specifically as an immigration and labor historian, and so I have a few different projects I'm working on within that vein. My first is my big manuscript project, taking my dissertation into a book, and that one looks at Milwaukee's Latino community throughout the 20th century. And I'm focusing specifically on religion as a place for community formation and social movement building across that time period, beginning with the arrival of the first Mexican industrial workers in the city in the 1920s, and really ending with the sanctuary movement of the 1980s here in Milwaukee. So that's one project. I'm also working with a group of colleagues from across the country in an edited volume on the expansion of Latino politics and Latino faith, the intersections across the 20th century. And then on top of that, I have some projects working on the sanctuary movement, both in the 1980s formation and its current manifestation as well. The first Latinos to actually come in Milwaukee actually began in the late 19th century, but those were often independent sojourners who were coming for very obscure reasons, whether they were artists or musicians coming to the city. The first large-scale migration of Mexican descent people really began in the 1920s in response to changing immigration laws. And so as the United States began to constrict immigration from Europe with the passage of laws in 1921 and 1924, Milwaukee industrialists, whether they were in tanneries or industry or different types of foundries, sent recruiters down to Mexico to bring workers to work in what were often the most difficult and the lowest paying positions. And so that community really began in the 1920s, dissipated in the 1930s with the Great Depression, as many people either left on their own accord or were forcefully deported from the United States, and then really blossomed again after World War II. The typical student at Marquette, I think, is changing in many ways. I was brought here not just to help grow the Latinx Studies program, but also be a part of the university's efforts to become a Hispanic-serving institution, which means that within 10 years, the goal of the university is to have a 25% Latinx or Latino student population. And I think that's in many ways reflected in the courses that I teach, whether it's in my kind of mainline history courses, classes on citizenship, or on Midwestern urban history, or on my classes on Latinx studies and Latinx social movements. I'm seeing, I think, a much more diverse student population within my classes that is going to represent the future of the university as well. When we talk about social movements in the United States, we have to be sure that we talk both about the inter-community, intra-community dynamics at play. And so last semester I taught a course on Latinx civil rights movements, but the class was very much also about how these movements were in conversation with other communities across the United States. Whether we're talking about movements following World War II to expand citizenship, not just for African Americans, but for Mexican Americans and Puerto Ricans, or perhaps kind of most dynamically during the civil rights era of the 1960s and 1970s, when you had Chicano, which were radical or at least politically activated Mexican American youth, and Puerto Rican youth through movements like the Young Lords, working hand in hand with organizations like the Black Panthers organization, Black Panthers Party, to really work to expand the definition of citizenship and access to full inclusion in the American political body. I think it's really important when we think about immigration history in places like Wisconsin that we have a very broad understanding of what that means. When I was a graduate student, immigration history often meant, especially when talking about the Midwest, European immigrants, which meant that history often ended in the early 1920s. But of course, my history begins at that point. And so when I talk with communities across the state, telling them about Latino history and Latinx history in the state of Wisconsin, I really want them to understand Mexican immigration and Puerto Rican migration, as well as immigration from across Latin America, as part and parcel of those immigrant histories. We can see that in many different ways. I think language is one of the kind of defining points that really connects the Latino experience with these other European experiences, right? So we know that Wisconsin was the home to some of the earliest and most vibrant dual language immersion programs at the turn of the century. Polish communities and German communities fought to have their language represented in the K-12 classrooms that their students were going to. And we see similar struggles over the last decade within Spanish-speaking communities, not only to elevate Spanish to a place of value within the classroom, but also as a way of sharing with communities that are not necessarily Spanish-speaking. Milwaukee is home for me, and so coming to Marquette was an opportunity to come home, not just to be with my family, but also to be near the community that helped raise me. My work, I think, really coincides really well with the mission of Marquette, which is to say that this is a university that has pledged itself to be one place within the urban space that it calls home, and that is constantly struggling to make sure that it is actually a part of that community. And my work is trying to do the very same thing, which is to say I study Milwaukee's Latino community, a history that goes back over 100 years, and to make sure that history is represented within the larger narratives that we tell about Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and the Midwest. Mexicans in Wisconsin was an opportunity for me to share some of the work that I had been doing in my dissertation. I'm a first-generation college student. My parents are both from Mexico. My family is mostly from Mexico as well, and so I wanted to have the opportunity to share some of this work that I had been doing over so many years in graduate school, work that sometimes is highfalutin and too academic for public consumption. And so Mexicans in Wisconsin was an opportunity to do that through the Wisconsin Historical Society Press. It's part of its Peoples of Wisconsin series. It really serves as an introduction to the history, the over century-long history of Mexican arrival, settlement, and incorporation into the state of Wisconsin. The next project that I'm working on is the continuation of my dissertation, taking that 500-page piece that took me years to write and now turning it into kind of a more consumable history book for the Academy. I think students are really hungry in my courses, whether it's in my Introduction to Latinx Studies, my Latinx Civil Rights Movements, or my Urban History and Citizenship classes, to talk about citizenship very broadly defined, right? So not just within the very constrained political and legal category of who has access to legal citizenship, but also what does cultural and social and economic citizenship actually look like. And because ultimately I think my students are invested in understanding what does it mean to consider yourself part of a larger community, whether that's an American community or Milwaukee community, and what are the barriers that cause certain aspects of communities to not be included within that larger story. So I think one of my favorite academic books is one that I read in graduate school. It's May Nye's Impossible Subjects. It talks really about the development of this legal category and the social construct of the alien citizen, or it's often referred to as the illegal alien. May Nye, as a scholar, really forces us to look at this idea, which is often considered just a legal category, as something that we perpetuate within our society, not only keeping people outside the bounds of legal citizenship, but keeping them outside the bounds of full inclusion within society. That's a topic that I come back to in all of my courses. So I think it's one that, and it's a book that I often teach at least sections of in my classes. My classes, although they're primarily history classes or interdisciplinary ethnic studies classes, are meant as introductions for students, often with the understanding that most of my students are not history majors. And so I'm very honest with my students when they enter my classroom in the first week. I know that most of them do not enter the class with the expectation of containing and remembering all of the content that we're going to go through throughout the semester. And so I want them to leave class with a certain amount of skills that will be transferable outside of a history class, to be better readers, to be better writers, to be more engaged members of their communities, and to have the skills to engage with those people around them. And so, for example, in my urban history class this semester, we're focusing on a project on how to write an op-ed, which I think is an important civic skill that all students should have as one avenue for them to take the information that we're discussing in class and being able to transmit it to a larger audience, taking their opinions, things that matter to them, and then being able to structure analysis around it to support it as well.